The kind of quiet that settles over a working-class neighborhood at dusk is different from any other quiet in the world. It isn't the polished silence of wealthy suburbs where stillness is maintained by distance and gates and the unspoken agreement that nothing uncomfortable will ever happen. It isn't the silence of emptiness either, of abandoned lots and boarded windows. It's a different thing entirely. It's the quiet of people who are tired in an honest way. Tired from work. Tired from the week. Tired in a way that feels earned rather than defeated. Porch lights come on. The smell of dinner drifts through screen doors. Children are called inside. Engines cool in driveways. On Delaney Street in Harlan County, Ohio, that quiet arrived every evening like clockwork, and most of the residents had long since stopped noticing it. It was simply the texture of their lives. But at the far end of the block, where the road curved slightly before dead-ending at an old chain-link fence, there was one house where the quiet never quite arrived. Because the garage at the end of that property was almost always open, and from inside it came the sounds of a man who had not yet finished his work. Metal on metal. The hiss of a pneumatic wrench. The low industrial hum of a compressor cycling. Sometimes the grinding wail of a cutting wheel throwing sparks that danced briefly against the concrete before dying. The sounds were not alarming to anyone who had lived on Delaney Street for more than a week. Because the sounds had been part of the block's atmosphere for 19 years, they were as familiar as the elm trees growing through the sidewalk cracks or the dog that barked every morning at the mail truck. They were in their own way reassuring. They meant Elias Carter was at work. Elias Carter was 52 years old. He had owned the property at 1141 Delaney Street for going on 2 decades. The house itself was modest. A 2-bedroom frame structure with a covered porch and a side yard that had long since been claimed by the garage which Elias had expanded twice over the years. He had added a rear bay when business warranted it, reinforcing the floor with a deeper concrete pour to handle the weight of the vehicles he worked on. The garage had a proper sign, Carter's Automotive, black letters on white, slightly faded but legible. He had never paid for advertising. He had never needed to. Word of mouth in a working-class neighborhood travels the way water finds cracks. Efficiently without effort, following the natural contours of trust. Elias was known. Not famous, not celebrated. Just known the way truly dependable people tend to be known in places where dependability is the most valuable currency available. He fixed engines. He diagnosed electrical faults that other shops had given up on. He charged fair prices, and sometimes he charged nothing at all. Particularly for veterans of whom there were several on Delaney Street and the surrounding blocks. He didn't advertise his generosity any more than he advertised his business. He simply did the work and moved on. He was a black man of medium height with broad shoulders that had thickened with age and large, careful hands that always seemed to know exactly where they were going. He kept his gray-threaded hair close-cropped. He wore the same thing almost every day. Dark work pants, a plain t-shirt, a shop apron when he was doing something particularly involved. He spoke when he had something to say, and he was quiet when he didn't. And the people on Delaney Street had long ago learned that the quiet was not coldness. It was simply the nature of a man who lived inside his work. On this particular Thursday in late October, Elias was deep inside a project that had been occupying the rear bay of his garage for the better part of 3 months. The vehicle was a black pickup truck, a heavy-duty 3/4-ton platform that he had sourced from a salvage auction 18 months prior, and then spent the intervening time rebuilding from the frame rails upward. To the untrained eye, it looked unusual. More than unusual. The doors were heavier than any stock door had any right to be. Reinforced from the inside with layered steel panels that had been cut and fitted with the kind of precision that spoke of something beyond ordinary mechanical skill. The frame had been gusseted and plated at the stress points. The suspension geometry had been recalculated and rebuilt with heavy-duty components that allowed for far greater load-bearing capacity without sacrificing articulation. The undercarriage featured a carefully shaped deflection plate that ran the full length of the chassis, angled according to calculations that had been worked out by hand on graph paper and then verified 3 times. The wiring harness was not from any catalog. It had been assembled from scratch. Every circuit designed for a specific purpose, routed with the meticulous care of someone who had spent years thinking about what happens to electrical systems when they are subjected to extremes: heat, concussion, moisture, vibration. Every connection was soldered and sealed. Nothing was left to chance. On the garage wall, mounted in a simple black frame, was a photograph. It was not a large photograph. It was positioned just to the left of the main light switch at roughly eye level. In it, a group of men stood in front of a convoy of heavy vehicles in a desert landscape. The sky behind them was bleached pale by heat. The vehicles were coated in the fine dust that settles on everything in that part of the world. The men were in various combinations of military uniform and civilian contractor gear. Standing third from the left, younger by 15 years but immediately recognizable by his posture and the cast of his face, was Elias Carter. He was not smiling in the photo. He rarely smiled in photographs. But there was something in his expression that was not quite neutral. Something that looked, if you studied it carefully, like a man who had just done something he considered worth doing. Nobody who visited the garage had ever asked about the photograph. That was partly because most customers stayed in the front bay and the photo was in the rear. It was partly because Elias did not invite questions about his personal history. And it was partly because in the way of working-class neighborhoods where people are careful with each other's privacy, nobody felt it was their business to ask. So the photograph had hung on the wall for years, and its meaning had never been explained to anyone in Harlan County, Ohio. 3 blocks away on the opposite end of Delaney Street, a woman named Linda Marsh was standing at her kitchen window with a phone in her hand. Linda Marsh was 67 years old, recently widowed and living alone for the first time in 40 years. She was not a cruel woman. She was not a prejudiced woman, or at least she did not think of herself as one, and in most of the ordinary circumstances of her life, she probably wasn't. But she was frightened in the way that elderly people living alone sometimes become frightened. Not of anything specific, but of things they don't understand, of noise they can't explain, of activity that seems outside the normal rhythm of things. She had been watching the deliveries to Elias's garage for 3 days. The flatbed that came with the large steel sheets. The heavy boxes marked with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to her. The grinding that went on past 9 at night. She had seen the truck through the open garage door, had seen the way it didn't look like any truck she'd ever seen, and something about it had lodged in the part of her brain where unease lives. She dialed the non-emergency line. She described what she'd seen. A black man cutting metal unusual parts, something that looked military. She used that word specifically, military. She said she didn't know if it was anything, but she thought someone should know. The dispatcher thanked her and logged the call. At the other end of the county, in a patrol cruiser parked in the lot of a fast food restaurant, Officer Ryan Cole received the dispatch. Ryan Cole was 38 years old and had been with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department for 11 years. By the official standards of his department, he was not an outlier. He showed up on time. He filed his paperwork. He had commendations on his record for 2 incidents that his supervisors considered noteworthy. In the official documentation of his career, he was a satisfactory officer who occasionally performed well. But there was another version of Ryan Cole's 11-year record, a version that existed not in the commendations file but in the complaint logs, which his sergeant, a man named Dale Horton, had a habit of reviewing slowly and acting on even more slowly. In that version, Cole had been the subject of 31 documented complaints over 4 years. almost all of them from residents of the working-class neighborhoods on the south and west ends of the county. Almost all of them involving the same basic pattern: a stop without clear justification, a search that exceeded what the situation warranted, a manner that witnesses consistently described as presumptuous and aggressive. 28 of those 31 complainants were black men. None of the complaints had resulted in sustained findings. Some had been reviewed, deemed inconclusive, and filed. Others had barely been reviewed at all. Cole had learned over 11 years that the system supposed to check his behavior was the same system that employed him, and that the two functions, oversight and employment, did not operate with equal energy. He had learned that the space between what he could technically do and what he should do was wide enough to drive through, and he had been driving through it for years. When the dispatch came through, Cole put down his coffee and pulled out of the lot within 30 seconds. He did not look up the address in the county property database. He did not run a cross-reference check. He did not contact the county assessor's office. These were all steps available to him. He skipped all of them. He arrived at Delaney Street with his hand already resting on the butt of his sidearm. The garage door was open, which it almost always was when Elias was working, because he liked the air and the light, and because he had never felt the need to hide what he was doing. He was working on his own property, on his own vehicle, on his own time. The openness of that garage door was an expression of the same uncomplicated confidence that ran through everything Elias Carter did. He had nothing to hide, and so he hid nothing. He heard the cruiser before he saw it, the particular crunch of tires on the gravel apron outside, moving with more speed and less caution than a casual visitor. He straightened up from beneath the hood of the truck, set down the tool he'd been using, and picked up the shop rag from the edge of the workbench. He was wiping his hands when Cole walked through the door, or more accurately, when Cole walked past the door. Because he did not stop at the threshold. He did not announce himself. He walked directly into the garage, as though the space belonged to him 3 full strides inside, before he said anything at all. He had passed without pausing a sign bolted to the doorframe that read, "Private property, Carter's Automotive, no entry without permission." Elias noted the sign being ignored. He noted Cole's hand position. He noted the set of Cole's jaw, already decided, already convinced of something. And he made a rapid, experienced assessment of the situation that drew on years of navigating environments where the wrong read of a person's posture could have very serious consequences. He said nothing yet. He stood with his hands visible, the rag in his left hand, his right hand open at his side. He waited. Cole stopped walking when he reached the truck. He did not look at Elias. He looked at the truck. He walked around its perimeter the way a man walks around something he's already decided is wrong, looking for evidence to confirm what he already believes rather than building a picture from what he actually sees. He pressed his hand against the driver's door, pressed hard as though testing its resistance. His eyebrows rose slightly when the door did not flex the way a normal door would flex. He crouched briefly and looked at the undercarriage, at the deflection plate, at the geometry of the suspension components. He stood up and looked through the window at the wiring running along the interior panels. Then he took out his personal phone and began photographing the truck. He did not ask permission. He did not explain why. He photographed the door, the undercarriage, the interior, the hood, the engine compartment. He photographed the blueprints spread across the work table 8 feet away. He took 11 photographs in total, and he took them all before he addressed Elias at all. When he finally turned, his expression carried the particular quality of a man who has already conducted his trial, arrived at his verdict, and is now simply going through the procedural formality of presenting the charges. "This your vehicle?" "Yes," Elias said. "Registration?" Elias moved to the workbench without rushing, deliberately unhurried. his movements slow and clear and visible. Because he had learned in contexts far more dangerous than this garage that clear movement and patience were things that kept situations from accelerating past the point of control. He retrieved the registration from the folder he kept on the shelf above the bench. He handed it to Cole. Cole studied it, turned it over, held it up slightly as though checking for watermarks or perhaps simply performing the theater of scrutiny for its own sake. The registration was current. It was clean. It listed the vehicle's identification number, which matched the plate. It listed the owner. Elias Marcus Carter, 1141 Delaney Street, Harlan County, Ohio. Everything on it was exactly what it should be. Cole set it on the workbench without handing it back. What are these modifications? It's a personal build, Elias said. Who authorized the armor plating? It's not armor plating in the regulatory sense, Elias said. It's structural reinforcement. Privately owned vehicles can be reinforced. There's no licensing requirement for the modifications I've made. Cole looked at him. The calm in Elias's voice was apparently not the response he'd expected, or not the response he'd wanted. Men who are confident in their authority often find calm in the people they question genuinely unsettling. Because calm implies a counter-authority, a self-possession that does not bend to the pressure of a badge. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "Where'd you get the design?" "I designed it," Elias said. "You designed it?" "Yes." Cole walked to the work table and looked down at the blueprints without touching them yet. They were dense with information. Load calculations in the margins, material specifications, stress test annotations, reference numbers. To someone with the appropriate background, they were the work of a sophisticated engineer. To Cole, they were incomprehensible, and things that are incomprehensible to people who expect to understand everything they encounter tend to read as threats. "You have documentation for all of this," Cole said. "I have documentation for everything in this garage," Elias said. "What specifically are you looking for? I'll know it when I see it," Cole said, and he reached for the blueprints. Elias watched Cole's hands touch the top page of the stack, watched him pick it up and turn it toward the light, and he saw in the upper left corner of the page, a corner that Cole was currently covering with his thumb, the faded but legible marking that Elias had never bothered to remove. A Department of Defense classification marking. He said nothing about it yet. Cole was already reaching for his radio. His transmission to dispatch used language that was specific and escalatory. Possible illegal military-grade vehicle conversion in progress. Unknown origin components. Requesting backup at 1141 Delaney Street. Also requesting notification to ATF Field Office. Possible unauthorized armored vehicle manufacture. Those words went out on a recorded government channel. They were time-stamped. They were logged. And somewhere in a federal monitoring system that tracks specific technical keywords in law enforcement communications, a system implemented after a series of incidents involving unauthorized access to military specifications, a flag triggered. It triggered against Elias Carter's contractor file. Neither Cole nor Elias knew this had happened. 2 backup units responded to Cole's call. They arrived within 7 minutes. And with them came the particular transformation that always occurs when a single officer's suspicion is multiplied by additional bodies and vehicles. The flashing lights, the blocked street, the sense of something official and serious happening which draws people out of houses and off porches and to the edges of driveways with the reliable magnetism of public drama. Neighbors gathered, 12 of them eventually. Some held phones. Some simply watched. Most of them knew Elias. None of them knew what was happening. And the not knowing made the watching both more urgent and more uncomfortable. One of the backup officers was a 29-year-old deputy named Marcus Webb. He had been with the department for 3 years and had developed over those years a habit that was not universal among his colleagues. He thought before he acted, not always, not perfectly, but consistently enough that it had occasionally made his shifts uncomfortable when he was paired with officers who preferred a more instinctual approach. Webb walked into the garage. He assessed the scene. Within 90 seconds, he had looked at the blueprints, at the truck, at the framed photograph on the wall, and at Elias's hands, which were calm and still and positioned where anyone could see them. And he had arrived at a level of uncertainty about the situation that Cole clearly did not share. He pulled Cole aside. "The paperwork looks real," Webb said quietly. "We should run his name before we do anything else." "I know what illegal looks like," Cole said, at a volume that was not particularly quiet. "This is it." He turned back to the garage before Webb could respond. The warrantless search began the way most warrantless searches do when they are conducted by officers who have already decided what they're looking for. Not with careful observation, but with confirmation seeking. Cole and the other officers moved through the space, touching things, photographing things, picking up tools and setting them down with the particular carelessness of people who do not believe the property belongs to anyone worth respecting. One officer picked up a section of the deflection plate that Elias had cut, but not yet installed. He held it up and turned it in the light. It was a curved piece of high-strength steel about 2 feet long, carefully shaped. He photographed it from 3 angles. He did not ask what it was. He had already decided it was evidence. The steel cabinet was in the rear corner of the garage. Gray-painted, padlocked. Cole pointed to it. "Open it," he said to Elias. Elias retrieved the key from the pegboard beside the cabinet, its location unhidden, available to anyone who looked. He unlocked the door without comment. The cabinet held 4 shelves. On them were a series of project logs bound in 3-ring binders, each labeled by year and project type. A collection of technical manuals, a small first aid kit, a coffee mug with a cracked handle that had been demoted from the break room to the cabinet some years ago. And on the bottom shelf, folded once and placed in a clear plastic sleeve, was a letter on Department of the Army letterhead. Cole picked it up, unfolded it, read it with the expression of a man reading a foreign language. Not without understanding, but with the specific strain of someone who recognizes the words individually, but cannot parse the meaning they make together. The letter was dated 8 years prior. It was addressed to Elias Marcus Carter and signed by a deputy program director for Vehicle Survivability Systems. It commended Elias for critical contributions to protective vehicle engineering on behalf of forward-deployed units. It used language about life-saving design solutions. It included a formal acknowledgement from the Department of the Army. Cole set it aside. "Unverified," he said, "to no one in particular, in the way of a man who has already made up his mind." Webb, standing at the entrance to the rear bay, looked at the letter. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at the photograph on the wall. Then he looked at the truck. Something in his understanding was beginning to shift. Not dramatically, not yet, but the way a structure shifts when a foundational assumption is quietly removed. He did not say anything, because Cole was already moving. Cole had gone back to the work table and was picking up the top sheet of the blueprint stack, the one with the classification marking in the upper left corner. He didn't cover it with his thumb this time. He held it up to the overhead light and studied it. Elias watched him hold a classified document under a fluorescent garage light and said very clearly and without raising his voice that the document had a classification marking in the upper left corner and that Cole did not have the clearance to be handling it. Cole looked at the corner of the page. He saw the marking. He processed it for a moment. "This is a crime scene," he said. "Everything in here is subject to documentation." "That document is subject to federal law," Elias said. "Photographing it without the appropriate security clearance is a federal violation." Cole photographed it. He photographed all 3 pages that carried markings. He did it slowly and deliberately, looking at Elias while he did it, in the manner of a man who believes that his authority makes him immune to the rules he is currently violating. He had been getting away with things for 11 years. He had no particular reason to believe that this day would be different. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing, because he had not run. The name had not checked the address, had not done any of the preliminary research that might have told him something useful about where he was and whose property he was standing on, was that the moment his radio transmission went out on the recorded federal channel, a flag had triggered in a monitoring system, and that when the flag triggered, an automated notification had been sent to a duty officer at a Defense Intelligence Agency field contact number, and that the duty officer, upon reading the notification and cross-referencing Elias Carter's file, had made a phone call. That phone call had been to a man named Colonel James Harlow. None of this was visible yet. The garage was still just a garage. Cole was still just an officer conducting what he considered a legitimate search. And the truck sat in the bay like a question that nobody had thought to ask correctly. 20 minutes into the search, Cole made a decision that transformed the situation from a private confrontation into a public spectacle. He ordered Elias out of the garage. Not because Elias had done anything, not because the garage had become unsafe, or because Elias had been uncooperative. He had been, by any objective measure, the most cooperative person in the building. Cole ordered him out because he wanted control of the space, and control of the space meant control of the person whose space it was. Elias walked out through the garage door and into the late afternoon light of Delaney Street. He stood where Cole directed him beside the hood of the nearest patrol car, hands resting lightly on the painted metal. And he looked at the gathered neighbors with an expression that carried no embarrassment, no anger, no appeal for sympathy. He looked at them the way a man looks at a landscape he is passing through, present, observant, undisturbed. The neighbors looked back. Several of them recognized in Elias's stillness something that made them uncomfortable in a different way than Cole's authority made them uncomfortable. Cole's authority had the discomfort of threat. Elias's stillness had the discomfort of witnessing something that should not be happening. A woman named Carolyn Price, who had brought her car to Elias every spring for the past 7 years and had never once been overcharged, took out her phone and began recording. 2 other neighbors followed. Cole noticed the phones. He did not tell anyone to stop. He was still operating in the confidence of his assumption. He made his second radio transmission from the street where everyone could hear him. He had upgraded his language. He used the phrase, "suspected illegal manufacture of unauthorized armored vehicle components." He used the phrase, "possible interstate trafficking of restricted materials." He said these things on a recorded government channel at a volume audible to 12 civilians, while Elias Carter stood 6 feet away with his hands on the hood of a patrol car. The words entered the federal monitoring system a second time. The flag on Elias Carter's file updated. The notification reached Colonel Harlow, who was by this point already in a vehicle. Inside the garage, while Cole was on the radio, Webb was completing the scene log. He was photographing, cataloging, recording, but doing it with a growing unease that had been building since he'd read the commendation letter. He photographed the cabinet contents. He photographed the tool organization on the walls, which was the meticulous arrangement of a person who had thought carefully about what tools belong where and why. And then he saw it. Tucked beneath the bottom layer of the blueprint stack was a document he had not previously noticed. A non-disclosure agreement. Current. The signature date was 14 months ago. It bore the seal of a DOD subcontractor naming Elias Marcus Carter as a party governing 3 ongoing consulting projects whose titles were redacted. The agreement itself was not classified. It was simply a legal document. But its existence communicated something clearly. Elias Carter was not a retired curiosity with a colorful past. He was an active participant in federal defense work, currently under contract, with current obligations and current protections. Webb photographed it and walked outside to where Cole was standing. "Cole," he said, "there's an active government contract in there. Current date." "Everything gets logged," Cole said. "Cole, if that's real, we're on different ground than you think." "Log it," Cole said, and turned away. Webb went back inside. He photographed the NDA. Then he stood in front of the framed photograph on the wall. He stood close enough to read the vehicles in the background, close enough to see the door panel geometry, the suspension profile, the undercarriage structure of the military vehicles in that desert photograph. He stood there for almost a minute, comparing what he saw in the photograph to what he could see of the truck in the bay. Then he took out his personal phone and photographed the photograph. He was not sure yet what he was going to do with what he was seeing, but something in the trained, careful part of his mind told him to keep records of his own, just in case. Cole made his arrest decision standing in the street outside Elias Carter's garage, while 12 neighbors watched and 3 phone cameras recorded. He had found what he had found: an unusual truck, technical blueprints he couldn't read, a commendation letter he'd dismissed as unverified, a steel cabinet of project materials, and a man who had been calm and cooperative throughout the entire encounter. He had found nothing illegal. He had found nothing that constituted probable cause for arrest under any statute that could be plainly cited. What he had found was something unfamiliar, which he had processed as something threatening, which he had treated as evidence, which he now needed to formalize into a charge. He wrote the arrest report in his head while he walked back to where Elias was standing. The language he chose was possession of components consistent with unauthorized manufacture of tactical military equipment. He added obstruction, though Elias had not obstructed anything, and failure to cooperate with a lawful investigation, which was not only false but demonstrably false, given that Elias had produced his registration on request, had opened his locked cabinet on request, had answered every question put to him, and had moved outside on request. None of that was going into the report. Cole told Elias he was under arrest. He stated the charges in the same flat, practiced tone he used for everything, the tone that communicated not just authority, but the certainty that authority would not be questioned. He produced his handcuffs. Elias said nothing. He did not argue. He did not move away. He turned slowly, put his hands behind his back, and waited. The cuffs clicked shut. The sound was audible in the street. Carolyn Price, recording on her phone, lowered it slightly and then raised it again. As Cole began walking Elias toward the patrol car, Elias turned his head briefly toward the garage, toward the rear bay, toward the wall where the framed photograph hung. And then he turned back. His expression had not changed. Whatever was running through his mind in that moment, it left no visible trace on his face. Marcus Webb, standing at the edge of the garage, watched Elias pass. He looked at Elias's hands, cuffed behind his back, still not pulling against the restraint. He looked at the photograph on the wall, visible through the open garage door. He looked at the truck. He felt in that moment the specific discomfort of a person who understands that something wrong is happening and has not yet decided what to do about it. Cole turned to the tow driver who had been standing by his flatbed for the past 10 minutes. "Take the truck," Cole said. "Impound lot." The tow driver moved toward the garage. He had a dolly and a set of straps, and the professional indifference of someone paid to move vehicles and not ask why. He began preparing to hook the truck. He had no way of knowing, and neither did Cole, that the truck contained components currently under an active federal development contract. That by moving it without authorization, they were initiating a process that would generate its own federal paperwork trail. That the moment the truck left Elias's property under police impound, a series of legal and procedural consequences would begin that Cole had not anticipated and was not equipped to manage. At the far end of Delaney Street, 2 blocks away, a black government-issue vehicle had appeared. It had dark windows and federal plates, and it moved slowly. The way vehicles move when the people inside them are assessing a situation rather than passing through it. It stopped at the corner. Marcus Webb saw it. He stood very still for a moment, watching it idle. Then he walked to his patrol unit, sat in the driver's seat, and opened the federal law enforcement database on his laptop. He typed in a name: Elias Marcus Carter. The query returned a file. The file had an access restriction above the visible portion of the record, but the portion he could see contained a single line of text before the classification block began. DOD Civilian Contractor, Security Clearance, TS/SCI, Contact Defense Intelligence Agency before any law enforcement action. Webb read that line 3 times. His mouth went dry. He picked up his phone and called the DIA field contact number listed at the bottom of the screen. The holding cell in the Harlan County Sheriff's Department substation was not a dramatic space. It was a room roughly 12 by 12 with a concrete bench bolted to one wall, a stainless steel fixture in the corner, and a fluorescent light that hummed at a frequency slightly too high to be entirely comfortable. The walls were painted the particular shade of institutional gray that exists, not because anyone chose it, but because it is the default. The color of environments designed without the expectation that anyone will find them pleasant. Elias Carter sat on the concrete bench, and he was still. He had been processed with the routine efficiency of a department that did this often, and had long since stopped thinking about what it meant in individual terms. Fingerprinted, photographed, property logged. He had said at the appropriate moment that he would like to make his one phone call. They had given him the phone. He had dialed from memory because he did not need to look up the number. The call lasted 11 seconds. He said 4 sentences. He hung up. Then he went back to the bench and sat down. And he was still. This is the kind of stillness that is difficult to describe accurately to people who have not experienced the specific context that produces it. The context of having navigated genuine danger. Not the theatrical danger of confrontation and adrenaline, but the sustained, patient danger of environments where losing your composure is a mechanical liability rather than simply an emotional failure. Elias had spent years in those environments. He had learned that stillness is not passivity. It is a form of control, the control of the self in the absence of control over everything else. He was not afraid. He was not performing not afraid. He was simply operating at a frequency that had been calibrated over years of practice, and the holding cell in the Harlan County substation, for all its unpleasantness, was not even remotely the most challenging space he had ever been required to be still inside of. He thought about the truck, about the work that was left on it, the list of remaining items that he kept in his head because he had always found that work stayed cleaner when you carried it mentally. He thought about the tow driver's hands on the straps and felt a brief flicker of something sharp and proprietary. Not quite anger, but its quieter cousin. Before he set that aside, too. The truck would either be returned or it wouldn't. What happened to it was not within his current reach. He waited. Across the building in the main office area, Ryan Cole was at his desk. He was writing his report, and he was writing it with a confidence that had not yet been touched by doubt. He had done what he believed he had done. He had identified a suspicious situation, investigated, found sufficient grounds, and made an arrest. This was the narrative. It was a clean narrative, and Cole had written it enough times that the writing came easily. He told Sergeant Dale Horton that he had busted an illegal arms operation. He used that phrase exactly. He said the truck alone was worth a federal case. He said the blueprints were sophisticated enough that federal agencies would want to look at them. He was not performing for Horton. Or not only performing. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Horton read the report. He read it slowly in the way of a man who has read a great many reports and knows that slowness is what allows discomfort to become visible. He read the charge language. He read the description of the vehicle. He read Cole's characterization of the commendation letter as unverified documentation. Horton said you didn't run his name before you arrested him. His behavior was enough, Cole said. His behavior, Horton repeated. He set the report down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. I'm going to log this for review, he said. Don't go anywhere. Cole nodded. He was unconcerned. Review was a thing that happened all the time. Review almost always ended the same way. Marcus Webb was not in the building. Webb had driven back to 1141 Delaney Street after Elias was taken in officially to complete the scene log. And he was doing that methodically, carefully. But he was doing it in a way that was now inflected by everything he had found in the database. He was looking at things he had already photographed and seeing them differently because the frame through which he was seeing them had changed. The commendation letter was not unverified documentation. It was a formal acknowledgement from the Department of the Army. The non-disclosure agreement was not a curiosity. It was evidence of an active federal relationship. The blueprints were not amateur designs. They were professional engineering documents, some of them carrying markings that meant something specific and serious. He stood in front of the framed photograph for a long time. He had been in the Army himself briefly before he'd gone into law enforcement. He knew what military vehicles looked like. He knew what the chassis of a blast-resistant vehicle looked like. What the door reinforcement geometry of a vehicle designed to protect occupants from lateral pressure looked like. He stood in front of that photograph and looked at the vehicles in the desert background. And then he turned and looked at where the truck had been. The same geometry. The same profile. The same design language translated from military specification to privately owned vehicle. Webb took a photograph of the framed photo with his personal phone. Then he sat in his patrol unit and called the DIA field contact number a second time because his first call had gone to voicemail. This time, someone answered. He explained what he knew. The address, the name, the arrest, the towed vehicle, the photographed documents. He spoke for about 4 minutes, and when he was done, the woman on the other end said, "Hold on." He heard background movement, muffled conversation, a door opening and closing. Then a man's voice came on the line. The man introduced himself as Colonel James Harlow, and the tone of his voice was the specific tone of controlled urgency that belongs to people who manage serious situations for a living and who have just encountered a serious situation that someone else has made considerably worse. Webb answered Harlow's questions. He answered all of them. And when Harlow was done asking, he said, "Tell your sergeant to expect visitors within the hour. And, deputy, don't touch anything else in that garage." Webb said he understood. He sat in his car for a moment after the call ended. The evening light was doing something particular on Delaney Street. The late October angle turning everything a pale amber gold, touching the leaves still on the elm trees, falling across the garage door that stood open on an empty rear bay. Neighbors had mostly gone back inside. The street was quiet. Webb thought about the moment he had pulled Cole aside and said the paperwork looks real. He thought about Cole's response. He thought about the gap between knowing something might be wrong and choosing to do nothing about it, and what that gap costs. He started the car and drove back to the station. 40 minutes after Elias had made his 11-second phone call, 2 vehicles arrived at the Harlan County Sheriff's Department substation, a black government SUV with federal plates, and behind it a military staff car. Dark green, official, moving with the unhurried certainty of vehicles that do not need to hurry because their authority is not in question. Sergeant Horton was at the front desk when they pulled into the lot. He watched a man in military uniform step out of the staff car. He watched a woman in a gray suit step out of the passenger side of the SUV. He looked at the way they moved, the economy of it, the purposefulness, the particular kind of confidence that does not need to perform itself. And in the space of about 4 seconds, he felt the preliminary arrival of a very bad feeling. He went to the door to meet them. Colonel James Harlow was 54 years old, and he had been working in defense intelligence for 22 of those years. In that time, he had developed a tolerance for a very wide range of human behavior, for incompetence, for arrogance, for the particular variety of institutional failure that results not from malice, but from the accumulation of small unchecked habits over long periods of time. He had developed through necessity the ability to manage his anger in situations that warranted it, to channel it into something functional rather than expressive. He managed it now as he walked through the door of the Harlan County Sheriff's substation, because expressive anger would not serve Elias Carter, and serving Elias Carter correcting what had been done to him was the only thing Harlow was interested in accomplishing. Margaret Chu, the Department of Defense attorney who walked beside him, had a briefcase and a face that communicated with complete efficiency that she had seen this kind of situation before and knew exactly how it ended. Sergeant Horton met them in the lobby. Sergeant Horton Harlow said, "It was not really a question." "Yes, sir," Horton said. "I'm Colonel James Harlow, Defense Intelligence Agency. This is Margaret Chu, Department of Defense Office of General Counsel. We're here regarding the arrest of Elias Marcus Carter, which occurred approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes ago on your department's authority." He said it in the way of a man stating facts, not making accusations, yet. "I need to speak with your watch commander. I need access to the arrest report. And I need to see Mr. Carter." Of course, Horton said. He did not ask them to wait. He did not suggest they take a seat. He turned and led them directly down the hall. Cole was at his desk when he heard the voices in the corridor. He couldn't make out the words, but he heard Horton's voice and then a voice he didn't recognize. Male. Measured. Carrying the particular resonance of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. And then Horton's voice again. And then footsteps. He looked up when Harlow and Chu entered the office area. He saw the uniform first, the insignia next. He was not particularly versed in military rank structure, but he knew enough to know that the insignia on Harlow's collar represented something significant, and that the bearing of the man wearing it was not the bearing of someone who had come to ask questions politely and accept whatever answers he was given. Cole's first instinct was to speak, to take control of the narrative, to begin managing the situation the way he had managed dozens of situations before. He opened his mouth. Harlow looked at him with the brief, flat assessment of a man who will address him when he is ready to address him, and not before. Cole's mouth closed. Horton presented the arrest report. Harlow and Chu reviewed it together at Horton's desk. And the silence they maintained while reading was the specific silence of people encountering something that they find both predictable and appalling. Predictable because they have seen its pattern before. Appalling because the pattern persists. Chu opened her briefcase and removed a folder. Inside were printed transcripts. Cole's radio transmissions time-stamped verbatim. She laid them on the desk beside the arrest report. She placed one finger on a specific line of the first transcript. Possible illegal military-grade vehicle conversion. She moved her finger to the second transcript. Suspected illegal manufacture of unauthorized armored vehicle components. Possible interstate trafficking of restricted materials. She did not say anything about these lines yet. She simply placed them there. Available. Visible. Harlow looked at Cole. "Officer Cole," he said, "I'm going to lay out for you clearly and in sequence what occurred this afternoon. Not as I believe it occurred. As it actually occurred with documentation." Cole said nothing. Harlow began. He said that Elias Marcus Carter is a civilian defense contractor with a Department of Defense security clearance at the top secret, sensitive, compartmented information level. that he has held that clearance continuously for 17 years, that he is currently party to 3 active consulting contracts governing his ongoing contribution to protective vehicle engineering programs, that all of this is documented, all of it verifiable, and none of it ambiguous. He said that Cole had entered Carter's garage without notification, which violated a standing protocol requiring law enforcement to contact the DIA before taking any action at addresses registered to contractors holding that level of clearance. A protocol that exists precisely to prevent situations like the one currently unfolding. He said that Cole had photographed 3 pages of restricted schematics without the appropriate security clearance, that this constituted a federal violation documented and actionable, and one that would now require formal reporting. He said that Cole had photographed an active non-disclosure agreement, which was a federal legal instrument without authorization. He said that Cole had ordered the impoundment of a vehicle containing components under an active federal contract which constituted unauthorized seizure of federally contracted materials. He said that Cole had filed an arrest report containing charges that had no factual basis whatsoever, that were not supported by a single piece of evidence gathered during the search, and that constituted at minimum the filing of false documentation on a government record. He said all of this in the same even-measured tone. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He simply placed the facts in sequence one after another the way a skilled person places bricks, methodically, squarely, each one bearing the weight of the next. The room was very quiet when he finished. Cole's face had changed. It had changed the way the confidence of a man who has never been seriously checked changes when it finally encounters something that will not bend around it, not collapsing all at once, but losing incrementally its architecture. The certainty that had been there an hour ago was still present in the form of his posture, but it had become a posture held together by habit rather than conviction. He was uncooperative, Cole said. It was the only thing left that he could say. Harlow looked at him. He provided his registration on request, Harlow said. He opened his storage cabinet on request. He answered your questions. He moved outside on request. He remained stationary at your direction throughout. He warned you explicitly that you were handling a restricted document, and you photographed it anyway. He paused. That is your definition of uncooperative. Cole said nothing. Harlow turned to Horton. I'd like to see Mr. Carter now, he said. Horton took him to the holding cell. The walk down the corridor was 22 steps, and each one felt to Horton like a step further into the specific territory of institutional consequence that he had spent 14 years as a sergeant trying to keep his department out of. The holding cell door opened. Elias stood when he heard the lock turn. He stood with the unhurried movement of a man who is not startled by things, who does not need to be startled, who exists at a level of preparedness that simply does not include the register in which ordinary surprises land. He looked at Harlow. Harlow looked at him. There are reunions of a kind that carry no sentimentality because the relationship they represent is not sentimental. It is something more durable than that forged in contexts where sentiment is a luxury and competence is the only currency that matters. Harlow and Elias had worked in proximity for 2 years a decade ago on a program that Elias had contributed to at a level that Harlow still considered privately among the most substantive individual engineering contributions he had observed in his career. They had not maintained regular contact after Elias left the program, because Elias had left precisely to have a different kind of life, and Harlow had respected that by not pulling him back. He said very simply that Elias should not be here, and that it was being corrected. Elias nodded once, and walked out of the cell without looking back at it. They walked back to the office area together. And Elias stood in that space, the space where he had been fingerprinted, where his property had been logged into a plastic bag, where Cole's arrest report sat on the desk, with its false charges typed in neat departmental font, and his composure was, if anything, more complete than it had been at any point in the preceding 2 hours. Because he had known from the moment he made his 11-second phone call that the call would produce this. He had not known exactly how long it would take. He had sat on the bench and waited. And now here was the result of waiting. Exactly as expected. Harlow turned to face Cole directly. And this was the moment, the one that Cole would replay with varying levels of revision for a long time afterward, where the full weight of what had happened arrived. Harlow did not conduct a speech. He said 4 things in sequence. He said that Elias Carter's vehicle work was not a personal curiosity. It was an extension of engineering principles that Carter had spent 17 years developing and refining. That the truck in the bay was built on the same design language as vehicles that had absorbed blast events in 3 combat zones and brought their occupants home. That 2 of those design elements were currently being adapted for the next generation of protective vehicle systems under active federal development contracts, and that Cole had called that work illegal manufacture of armored components on a government recording. That recording, Harlow said, is now part of a federal file. Cole's hands, which had been resting on the edge of the desk, moved slightly. A small, involuntary movement, the kind made by hands seeking something to hold on to. Then Chu did something quiet and devastating. She reached into her briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the desk beside the arrest report. It was a printout of the federal monitoring log. Time-stamped, flagged, containing the verbatim text of Cole's 2 radio transmissions, and a notation that read, "Security Protocol Trigger, Flagged Contractor File. DIA notification sent." She pointed to the timestamp of Cole's 2nd transmission. She pointed to the timestamp of the DIA notification. She pointed to the timestamp of Harlow's vehicle dispatch. "You summoned us," she said. "Every word you said on that channel is how we knew to come." Cole had built the trap with his own radio. Marcus Webb, who had been standing near the door since returning from Delaney Street, placed his personal phone face up on the desk. On the screen was the photograph he had taken of Elias's framed photo, the convoy in the desert, the vehicles, the design language visible even in the background of an old personal photograph. Beside it, on a split screen, was a photograph he had taken of the truck before it was towed. The door panel geometry, the chassis profile, the undercarriage structure, identical. Horton looked at the phone. He looked at the arrest report. He looked at Cole. "Ryan," he said, "go wait by the front desk." Cole went. The truck was returned to 1141 Delaney Street before the sun finished setting. 2 federal agents drove it back on a government flatbed more carefully than it had been taken. They parked it in the rear bay and closed the garage door and left. The impound order had been reversed within the hour. The scene tape was removed. The property was returned to the condition of a private residence and licensed automotive business, which is what it had always been. Elias Carter's arrest record was formally voided that evening. The voided record sat in the system as evidence not of something Elias had done, but of something that had been done to him. Cole was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a joint investigation by the department's Internal Affairs Division and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Sergeant Horton walked him out of the building at the end of the shift. Cole moved through the space where he had worked for 11 years, past the booking desk where Elias had stood 2 hours earlier, past the radio equipment where his transmissions had been logged, past the door with the department seal. He did not look up at any of it. The investigation that followed was not quick, but it was thorough. Internal Affairs pulled Cole's full record. 31 complaints over 4 years. 28 involving black male residents of working-class neighborhoods. 0 resulting in charges. The pattern was not ambiguous when the full data set was arranged chronologically and cross-referenced with patrol zone data. Cole had been stopping people in those neighborhoods at a rate that crime statistics alone could not explain. Individual complaints reviewed one at a time and dismissed one at a time had never been allowed to tell that story. Arranged together, they told it clearly. The Department of Defense security breach inquiry confirmed that Cole had photographed 3 pages of restricted schematics and 1 active federal contract without authorization. These were not catastrophic violations in isolation, but combined with the false arrest charges, they created a federal component to Cole's case that made the department's standard internal resolution process unavailable. The police union reviewed the file. They reviewed it specifically looking for the standard angles: procedural error, contextual ambiguity, the officer's reasonable belief at the time of the incident. And they found, under the weight of Cole's own radio transmissions, his own arrest report, the federal documentation, and Webb's careful personal photographs, that the standard angles did not hold. Cole's union representative communicated with practiced quietness that fighting the termination would not be advisable. Cole was terminated 19 days after the arrest. His pension eligibility was voided on the grounds of federal misconduct. The termination was public record required by county transparency ordinances, and it was reported in the county paper and briefly picked up by 2 regional television stations before moving on in the way that regional news stories move on. Linda Marsh, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after everything had settled, walked down Delaney Street and knocked on the open garage door of Carter's Automotive. Elias was inside working. She said that she had seen what happened. She said she had not understood what she was looking at when she made her phone call. She said she was sorry. Elias set down his tool. He looked at her. He said that he understood why she'd called, that she had seen something she didn't recognize and hadn't known what it meant, and that it was finished now. She asked if there was anything she could do. He said she could let him get back to work. She went home. She did not know whether Elias had forgiven her because he had not offered that word, and she thought in the days that followed that perhaps it was not her right to ask for it, that forgiveness, like most things of value, could not be requested. It could only be earned through future behavior, which is a longer and quieter project than an apology. 3 months after the arrest, the rear bay of Carter's Automotive on Delaney Street was almost exactly as it had always been. The tools were in their places on the pegboard. The overhead light hummed its familiar note. The framed photograph was still on the wall exactly where it had always been because Elias had seen no reason to move it. On the workbench beneath a set of combination wrenches sat a letter on Department of the Army letterhead. A formal communication acknowledging the incident and reaffirming Elias's contractor status and security clearance with no interruption. Signed by Colonel James Harlow. Elias had not framed it. He had not posted it anywhere visible. It was a document that said what was true, and what was true had not required the document. He kept it under the wrenches because that was where he'd set it when it arrived, and he hadn't moved it since. The truck sat in the corner of the bay, finished. All the work that remained on the day of the arrest had been completed in the weeks following because the work had always been the point. And nothing that had happened changed that. It sat exactly as he had designed it. Not dramatic, not threatening, not anything other than what it had always been. A vehicle built by someone who had thought very carefully about what it meant to protect the things that mattered, and had built accordingly. Marcus Webb visited once. He came not only to apologize, but to return a small socket wrench that had been accidentally logged into the evidence inventory during the garage search, and had taken 3 weeks to clear through property management. He handed it to Elias at the garage door. Elias took it, looked at it briefly, set it on the workbench. Webb said that he had tried to say something that day. Elias said that he knew. They stood in the familiar quiet of Delaney Street for a moment, and then Elias went back to work, and Webb walked back to his car, and whatever needed to pass between them had passed. In the county's officer training database, 2 new entries were added to the case study library. The first was filed under Cole's name. A documented example of what happens when procedural shortcuts, confirmation bias, and unchecked assumptions compound across a single incident. The second was filed under the heading of Federal Contractor Protocol, and it established for the first time as mandatory, rather than recommended, the requirement that any law enforcement action at an address registered to a federal contractor must include a cross-reference check before engagement. The requirement was 2 sentences long. It had been created because a mechanic on Delaney Street had refused to be anything other than exactly who he was, had stood at the hood of a patrol car with his hands visible and his composure intact, and had waited with the patience of a man who understood from long experience that the truth does not need to be defended. It only needs to be given time. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to our channel and never miss a story.